This is the second book in the Wizard of Once series. There are 5 parts in this book. Each part will release one at a time to build up the suspension. Side note, I do not claim by any right to say that I published them, but give full credit to Cressida, Cowell, and David Tennant. Subscribe and turn on notifications to find out what happens next. I hope these books give you the joy and magic they give me when I listen to them. Enjoy and listen intently.
8. Following the Sweet Track. "But you promised your mother," said Bodkin in an agonised sort of way. "You said you'd go back home straight away. This isn't our problem." "It is our problem," said Wish. "We all let the King Witch out of the stone, and Tsar is our friend, so we have to help him. We can't just sit behind the wall twiddling our thumbs while Tsar goes through all this on his own." "I have to agree with Bodkin the bodyguard," said Caliburn. "That's a really, really bad idea. Your type of magic is very dangerous, Wish, and the witches want that magic. On the other side of the wall, the witches can't get at you, but over here—" "You need our help," argued Wish. "The spell talks about how you should stir the ingredients with a living spoon, and I'm the one who has the living spoon." The enchanted spoon, delighted to be playing such an important role, gave a small, proud bow to the rest of the company. "You should both go back to your parents," moaned Caliburn to Tsar and Wish. "I know they're a little unreasonable, but if you explain everything to them, maybe they could help you. This is a bigger problem than the two of you can deal with. Much bigger, much more dangerous. This is a long step a high walk a giant of a problem." "All right, Crusher, what do you think?" Wish shouted up to Tsar's giant. Crusher was picking leaves from the topmost branches of the trees and eating them. He put his face down a little closer, and you could see that it was covered with wrinkles and laughter lines like the wandering paths on an old map, and his eyes were kind and wise.
"I was thinking," said Crusher, dreamily, speaking very slowly, for giants operate in a different time scale from everyone else, "about language, and how in English 2 negatives make a positive, but in Spritish a double negative is still a negative. However, there is no language in which 2 positives make a negative."
"Yeah, right, like that's the problem," said Tsar sarcastically.
"I hadn't thought of that,"
said Crusher in gentle surprise, but delighted that Tsar was engaging with his mental processes.
"You're correct, Tsar. Yeah, right. Is a statement in English where 2 positives make a negative."
Crusher was a wonderful giant companion, but he could sometimes be on a different planet from everyone else. "That wasn't what I meant," said Tsar in exasperation. "Stop thinking big thoughts, Crusher. The real problem is, should Wish come with us or go back to her scary mother?"
"Oh,"
said Crusher, even more thoughtfully. He paused for an impressively long time, and then said,
"Well, Wish should come with us because I like her."
Strangely enough, it was this simple statement that changed Caliburn's mind. "All right," he said with a sigh. "I suppose this is all such a disaster that it doesn't really matter what we do, as long as we're with our friends and we do it together. As long as everyone promises that we will take breaks for lessons along the way," he went on. "I don't want any of you getting behind in your studies. You 3 need all the education you can get." They looked up the way to Castle Death in the Maps section of the spelling book, which very helpfully lit up the various routes across the wildwoods with different colours of sprite dust. Purple dust was a warning to the traveller to be careful, red dust meant exceptional danger, and yellow dust marked the safer passages. Castle Death, in the heart of the Witch Mountains, was across a land to the west called the Slodger Territories, a vast bog-like desert that stretched for miles in every direction. And the Slodger Territories were dangerous, for Grindylows and Greenteeth lived in those marshes, strange, part see-through creatures with huge sad eyes who reached out skinny arms and dragged you down under the muddy water with little satisfying belches of the bog. The only safe way, marked in yellow across the Slodger territories, was the Sweet Track, an ancient road like a long winding bridge, built and blessed by wizards long ago. You can't be attacked on the Sweet Track, for it was guarded by a very ancient power, and spells too old to unravel. They didn't want to use magic to get there, for magic was tiring, and Wish was already so exhausted by the effort of making the door fly and keeping it in the air by her sheer will that she could feel every muscle in her body aching. Also, the use of magic would make it easier for witches or other bad things to trace them. The broken door had smashed to pieces on landing, but they might need it later, so it was the sprites who put it back together again with their wands. A fairy making a spell is a little like someone taking a golf shot or a baseball swing in another time, another place. It's not just a matter of pointing the wand in a careless fashion. The spell is thrown up in the air, the wand goes right behind the head and then smashes the spell towards the thing that it is wanting to enchant, preferably for full power with a great deal of follow-through. The spells spun through the air, singing the word "Reconstruct!" and scoring a direct hit on the smashed door, and the pieces instantly sorted themselves out, organising themselves swiftly on the floor like a puzzle rearranging itself, at first forming a ridiculous pattern that didn't look like a door at all, before whizzing back together again magically in the right place, as if magnetically attracted to one another. Crusher put the enchanted door in his pocket, and Tsar, Wish and Bodkin climbed aboard the snowcats' backs, and the giant slowly walked his way through the holloways to the beginning of the Slodger territories, the wolves and the snowcats running by his side, the sprites and Caliburn flying overhead. After 6 hours of walking, they reached the famous bridge, beginning in the woods itself and then stretching way, way into the distance across the marshes like the coils of an enormous snake. They decided to camp on the bridge of the Sweet Track for the night. "And we should lay the campfire on the bridge itself," said Caliburn, "for once it gets dark, that is the only place where we will be truly safe. What is the best wood for a campfire that might put off green teeth? Bodkin? Wish?" Bodkin and Wish had absolutely not the foggiest of an idea. A warrior education tended to focus on maths work and letter work and sword work and farming skills. Woodwork was not really part of anything they knew. "Goodness gracious," said Caliburn, very shocked. "Don't they teach you anything over there in Iron Warrior Fort? This is elementary stuff. How do they expect you to survive in the forest if you don't know that?" "I's know," said Squeeze-Juice. "Alder or rowan is for protection, and hawthorn makes a nice hot fire." So Tsar and Wish and Bodkin gathered alder wood from the forest, and then they arranged a little ring of stones to put the wood on to make their campfire. "Let me practice lighting it with staff magic," said Tsar. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," said Caliburn hastily. "I have to practice controlling the magic, and you were the one who said we should be doing lessons," said Tsar. He looked up the spell in the spelling book and then held out his arm with the witch stain on it, his father's yew spelling staff gripped firmly in that hand. "Let the magic come out slowly," advised Caliburn, "in a controlled and focused manner. Think gentle, calm, happy thoughts. Be patient." But nothing happened. And Tsar was not a patient person. He went red in the face with exasperation. He shook the staff crossly. "Why isn't it working?" "Oh, I've been looking up about spelling staffs. I think you might be holding the staff at the wrong end. You hold it like this," said Wish, helpfully putting her hand on the staff to show him the grip she had read about in the spelling book. And the moment that Wish put her hand on it as well, the magic came screaming out of the staff with such force that the little campfire of alder and hawthorn twigs exploded, and Wish and Tsar and Bodkin and the wolves and the snowcats and the werewolf were all blown off their feet by the force of the explosion and into the bog. "Don't get discouraged, everyone," announced Caliburn, as they all staggered muddily to their feet, amidst a strong smell of burning feathers and singed fur of werewolf. "It can take quite some time to learn how to control magic." The explosion had blasted a great big hole in the bridge of the Sweet Track, where the ancient timbers, which had lain there quietly and peacefully for so many centuries, had been smashed in two, and now smouldered ominously with little flickering green flames at the blackened edges. "Oh dear, was that me?" said Wish apologetically. "I'm so sorry. I've always been a bit clumsy." "No, it could happen to anyone," said Caliburn with a nervous glance at Wish, for the power that protected the sweet track was a very ancient power indeed, and the bridge really ought to have remained intact, whatever spells were thrown at it. He had never heard of any magic, past, present, or future, that could have an effect on the sweet track. It didn't seem the best of omens for the start of their expedition. They regathered wood and relaid the fire a bit further down the bridge, and Bodkin lit it by the warrior method of using a little iron fire striker against flint, which deeply impressed the sprites. Less spectacular than Tsar's way, but more effective. The sprites then blew out the fire in order to show off to Bodkin that they could relight it with their sprite breath in all sorts of beautiful colours, yellow, red, green, blue. Wish tore up the note she wore around her neck, saying, "I am a fuel," and put it on the fire, and the note burned happily with rainbow brightness. And then they made a delicious nettle stew. Crusher gathered the nettles, stuffing his pockets with handfuls and handfuls of them, for they would need food for the journey ahead, and not much food was to be found in the Slodger territories. Wish and the sprites found water, and Bodkin did the cooking. The werewolf, thoroughly overexcited by his new-found freedom in the wildwoods, returned from his own hunting expedition with an entire mouthful of worms, which he deposited triumphantly in Wish's lap as a helpful addition to the stew. The werewolf seemed to have taken a bit of a shine to Wish. "That's a lovely idea, Lonesome," said Wish tactfully, not wanting to hurt his feelings. "But maybe you could have those on the side, or as a starter. I think Bodkin may be allergic to worms. Aren't you, Bodkin?" "Definitely allergic to worms," said Bodkin firmly. The Tsar wanted to try one, but Caliburn wouldn't let him. The enchanted spoon stirred the stew with such enthusiasm that he turned it into a positive whirlpool, and on a couple of occasions he very nearly fell in and had to be rescued by Tsar or Bodkin or Wish. Bodkin announced that the stew was ready, and the werewolf leapt up and thrust his entire head into the saucepan and began noisily slurping. Tsar pulled him out, and Caliburn explained to the rather crestfallen werewolf about manners, while the sprites cartwheeled through the air in fits of giggles. Tsar had managed to steal a saucepan while he was on the run, but he hadn't got any plates, which was fine, because they just ate off large leaves. And I don't know whether it was the cold night air and the adventure of the day, or the way that the enchanted spoon stirred that stew, but it was the most delicious stew that anyone had ever tasted. That was a happy, happy evening. Even Bodkin was happy. He couldn't quite think why. He had lost most of his armour, which should have left him more anxious, but somehow he felt lighter and braver. At least he could bend over. He joined in with the songs around the campfire. The moon came up over the marshes, a big, round, full one, and the werewolf howled at it, and Tsar joined in. "Urr, urr, urr!" "Is it just me?" whispered Bodkin to Wish, "or is that werewolf not a very good influence on Tsar?" "Give the werewolf a chance," said Wish. "He just hasn't been around people very much." Eventually they fell asleep on the boards of the sweet track, and even though the air was bitterly cold, they were all snuggled round with the wolves and the snowcats, and the bear and their shaggy coats kept them warm. The smoke from the fire curled gently upward, constantly changing colour, blue, red, orange, white. Crusher stayed awake, watching out for witches and other bad things. He sat cross-legged in the bog, humming and singing very softly to himself. Much later, Wish woke up. "Having trouble sleeping, little one?" said the giant, stopping singing for a moment and bending down to look at her. "I'm worrying about going to Castle Death, and the witches," shivered Wish. "How can you not worry, Crusher?" The giant laughed. "What I generally find is that if there is some giant problem in the world, some giant answer turns up just in time to solve it." The raven, who was also awake, harumphed a little, but he did admit, "That is the lesson of history." "Worrying won't help it turn up any sooner, and look," continued the giant, "if you waste your time worrying, how will you have a moment to see how beautiful the world is?" His giant fingers closed around Wish, and gently he carried her up, up, up into the air. Wish had a heart-stopping moment of excitement to find herself looking down on the world rather than up at it. Crusher put her into his pocket, and she peered over its rim, the wind blowing her hair back. From here, in the moonlight, she could see for miles and miles across the wasteland, and way, way in the distance, the misty outlines of the Witch Mountains. Somewhere out there was Castle Death. But from the safety of the giant's pocket, all she could think of was how calm it was, how still, with the moon above the marshes and the wind blowing steadily. The giant began to sing.
A giant heart needs a giant life. Giant arms can hold a world.
Every time he sang the word giant, he threw out his arms wide, and Wish bounced around unsteadily in his pocket, giggling.
Let me lead a giant's life. No little steps, no holding back. A giant way, a giant's track. Let my mistakes be giant ones, for I can't live in little worlds. I need the space to run my fill. I need to jump from hill to hill. And if you take my woods from me, I'll wander out into the sea and try to find another world so I can live a giant life.
And down on the sweet track, the sound of the giant singing woke Tsar and Bodkin and the sprites, and it was so joyful it really put heart into the little party. The werewolf even joined in with his own song, which I have translated here because otherwise it sounds mostly like howling. Me and the moon and me, when all the world gives up on me, when everyone thinks bad about me, I still have the moon. It's me and the moon, it's always the moon and me. So I have to keep running, can't stop in case I bite someone. Keep running, I thought I was good, and then I looked down. My shaggy coat, my wolfy paws, I'm bad as a snake, and meaner than grit. Don't try to stop me, 'cause you will get bit. Let me keep running. I'm running for the moon, up to the moon, where I can be good. When all the world gives up on me, when everyone thinks bad about me, I still have the moon. It's me and the moon. Mostly it's me and the moon. Every now and then the werewolf would break off to howl, ow, ow, ow. And Wish and Bodkin joined in with the warrior war song. No fear, that's the warrior's marching song. No fear. While Tsar and the sprites sang the magic lament, once we were wizards wandering free in roads of sky and paths of sea.
Let me lead a giant's life,
sang Crusher. Mostly it's me and the moon, sang Lonesome. Arr, 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 arr. And as the songs blended on the midnight air, they seemed to be defying and taunting the many, many people and creatures who were now chasing Wish and Tsar. Tsar's father was looking for him, searching the countryside in the form of a great golden eagle. And Queen Sycorax and the witch-smeller, and something worse was following them. For as I said earlier, when Tsar escaped from Gormancrag, there might have been some things that helped. Things that had soft black wings and feathers for arms, and talons like swords on the ends of their claw-like hands. things that might have been witches. Well, they weren't helping him now. They were after him. For Tsar, all unknowing, had done what the King Witch wanted. He had brought Wish from behind the wall, and now she was out in the open, unprotected, and if the witches could get their claws on her and bring her to the King Witch sooner than expected, why, then, so much the better. Tsar and Wish are on a quest together now, but they are being chased by dark forces. Can they get away? Part 2. The Witch Trap. 9. A couple of nasty surprises on the way to Castle Death. Tsar woke very early the next morning, his right arm aching and burning. He shook Wish awake, and within seconds of opening her eyes, her heart was beating as quick and panicked as that of a small forest creature who knows it's about to be attacked. There was a coldness in the air that they both remembered from before, a chill that sank into the bones and froze the blood and smudged the thoughts, and the hair on Wish's head rose up with electric, fizzing energy. For the smell was familiar too, a stinking reek of decaying cat and corpse's breath and burning hair with a sulphurous kick of rotten eggs, a smell that brought Tsar out in a frightened sweat. For it was the smell of witches. All around them, the animals were waking into instant terrified alarm, their fur bristling around their necks in ruffs, and the sprites flew shaking up into the air, burning bright with fear, drawing their wands sharp as thorns, reaching into their spell bags. Wish felt for the enchanted sword. But to her horror, she found that for some reason she couldn't take it out of the scabbard. It was stuck fast. She could hear her own breath. There was something under the bridge. She had a glimpse from between the boards of something dark and feathery, moving slowly, nauseously, greasily beneath them. "Run!" yelled Wish at the top of her voice, as with a high, unearthly wail, 3 great talons came up from below, piercing right through the planks of the bridge a couple of yards back from where they were standing. Wish and Bodkin and Tsar leaped onto the backs of the snowcats, and they and the wolves and the werewolf all ran for their lives along the length of the sweet track, with the sprites and Caliburn flying terrified above, and Crusher stumbling to his feet and splashing noisily through the bog, following them all. Wish looked over her shoulder as the snowcats ran further along the bridge across the marshes. There were the woods, dark in the distance. There was the broken bridge. There was the place where they had camped. There was the spot where Wish had seen the witch's talons, but there was nothing to be seen of those talons now. Where had the witch gone? They ran on along the sweet track until the woods were just a distant smudge on the horizon, and the snowcats were so tired that their weary paws moved slower and slower still until they limped and lumbered into a panting walk. "I think," puffed Caliburn, "that we're safe now. That witch would only have been able to attack us because the explosion yesterday may have broken the magic that protects the bridge at that particular point." "Why couldn't I draw the enchanted sword?" said Wish, puzzled and shaken. "It wouldn't come out, however hard I pulled it. But it's coming out really easily now." Sure enough, now they were out of danger, she had taken the sword out of the scabbard with one light touch. "I always said that sword was a bit wayward," said Caliburn nervously. "It has too much of a mind of its own." They all stopped to examine the sword. "That's odd," said Bodkin, noticing something for the first time. "The writing on the blade looks different." "It must have got scratched or worn away at some point," said Wish. It was an unfortunate scratch. For somewhere since their last adventure, a deep scrape on the blade had changed the inscription from "Once there were witches, but I killed them," to "Once there were wishes, but I killed them." It was a much gloomier message somehow, the idea of wishes being buried, and particularly gloomy when one of your party is actually called Wish. "It's just a scratch," said Wish, firmly putting the sword back in the scabbard. "It was an accident. It doesn't mean anything." They kept on walking, trying not to see this as a bad omen, and to put as much distance as possible between themselves and that witch attack. But it was only much, much later in the day that Wish's heart began to beat a little slower again. That little incident made the spell-raiding band somewhat uneasy, as you can imagine. But you can't stay frightened forever. And over the next few days there was absolutely not a hint of a witch, or even a grindy-low, or a green-teeth, only curlews and kingfishers, lapwings and snipe, wheeling and calling and singing over the bog. They got back into a happier rhythm, walking across the sweet track, across the endless marshes, and when they stopped for a rest, Caliburn would give them magic lessons, sitting on the bridge, their legs swinging. For Tsar, the lessons were based around patience, calmness, not losing his temper when he practiced the spells. This was particularly important because Tsar was working with his father's staff rather than his own one, which had been left behind in the wizard fort when Tsar was taken to Gormancrag. Incanzo's staff was not supposed to be used by beginners, particularly those who have a witch stain, so things often went wrong. For instance, Tsar helpfully tried to make Caliburn's feathers grow back, because the old bird had lost so many from the sheer worry of being Tsar's adviser. He pointed his father's staff as calmly as possible, and the feathers went on growing, and growing, and growing, until Caliburn had a tail as long as a peacock's that trailed over the edge of the bridge and into the bog below. Squeeze-Juice and the hairy fairies were in fits of giggles. It took a couple of hours of concentrated spell work for Ariel and the sprites to get the feathers to grow small again, and 2 days later, Caliburn still had an amusingly fluffy bottom. Caliburn was a dignified bird, so he got very cross if he caught the hairy fairies pointing and laughing at it. With Wish, Caliburn concentrated on things that were easiest for her first, to build up her confidence. Wish found things made out of iron the simplest to move, so Caliburn had her pushing up her eye patch a little and practising with her pins, making them dance and moving them like little armies, and even getting them to have pin fights with each other. "I understand things so much better when you're teaching me, Caliburn, rather than Madame Dreadlock," said Wish triumphantly. "Madame Dreadlock is just a little too shouty, and it's difficult to focus when someone is yelling at you." The key from the punishment cupboard had decided it was in love with the enchanted spoon. The head of the key formed a little mouth, and every now and then it would shout in its enthusiastic, creaky little voice, "Spoon, where are you?" The enchanted spoon was a bit frightened of the key, and had taken to hiding because the key kept on wanting to kiss the spoon. Wish was so delighted with her success in bringing the spoon and the key and the pins to life that she accidentally did the same with Bodkin's fork, and regrettably that created a love triangle. The fork decided that it was in love with the key and that the unfortunate spoon was its main rival. So Bodkin would be trying to eat his supper, and the fork would leap heroically out of Bodkin's hand to pin the enchanted spoon to the ground. Or the spoon would find itself being stalked, and the fork would challenge it to a fight, and the spoon would stick out its chest like a proud swordsman, and the two of them would conduct a complicated spoon and fork fight, lunging and parrying and duelling and ambushing each other across the sweet track. Caliburn progressed from lessons on moving things into lessons on magnetism. The enchanted spoon was very patient when Wish gave him many variations of hairstyles made out of pins that she made magnetically attached to his head. One day, Wish's hand slipped on her eye patch, and the spell from her magic eye was a little too strong. It sent the enchanted spoon cartwheeling through the air like a spinning spelling staff, pins scattering in all directions before he landed upside down, stuck fast to the top of Bodkin's forehead. And there the spoon stayed, doing a headstand, his handle moving up and down like a kicking leg as the key cuddled up to him, cooing, "Poor spoon, poor spoon." This all passed the time very merrily, until after a week or so they reached the edge of the Witch Mountains, which rose eerily out of the edge of the marshes. Castle Death was somewhere on the edge of those mountains, but all the paths on the map had petered out, so there was absolutely no sign of how to get to it. "Whoever lived in Castle Death long ago didn't want to be found," explained Caliburn. "How are we going to find it then?" asked Bodkin very reasonably. "This mountain range is huge. We could be searching for this castle for the next 12 months. They had to leave the sweet track to get to the Witch Mountains. This led to the second bad thing that happened on the way to Castle Death, and it was far worse than the first, even though, in a way, it solved their problem of how to find the castle. Camping on the edge of the marshes, Wish was woken early one morning by a cold presence. She tried to draw the enchanted sword, and for some wayward reason of its own, once again it would not budge, however hard she pulled it. Crusher reached out his giant hand to protect Wish. The snowcats pounced. Too late. "My spoon!" cried Wish in horror. "He's gone! Something's taken my spoon!" "What do you think it was?" asked Bodkin. "Was it a witch? Was it a ghost? Was it a grindy-low?" But neither Wish nor Crusher had seen what it was, and there were all sorts of nasty creatures that lived in the Witch Mountains. "It can't have been anything magical," argued Tsar. "Magic things are afraid of iron. Maybe it was a bear or something." They searched and searched, but they could not find the spoon anywhere. Poor Wish was inconsolable. "I should never have led my spoon into all this danger," she wept. "He's going to be so frightened." And then, a while later, and 100 feet or so away from the edge of the campsite, the enchanted key gave an excited squeak, and it and the fork and the pins came hopping back to Wish, the key crying in its little creaky voice, "We've picked up his trail!" Wish's heart leapt, and the little party followed the enchanted things, who hopped purposefully ahead, pausing every now and then to smell some scent that only other enchanted things could detect, that was telling them which way the spoon had gone. At first, Wish was hopeful that they might find him quite quickly, but minutes turned into hours, and darkness fell, and they still had not found the spoon, and eventually they had to decide to camp for the night and carry on looking for him the next day. And a broken-hearted Wish had to go to sleep without her spoon. They didn't find him the next day either. Or the next. "Don't worry, Wish," said Tsar on the 4th day. "We will find him, I promise. Don't give up hope. I know what it can be like, losing a great companion. We're constantly losing you, aren't we, Squeeze Juice? But we always find you again in the end." But each night they had to camp without finding him. It got harder and harder, and Bodkin lay awake by the campfire, looking up at the stars, realizing bleakly that adventures were wonderful and exciting, but the stakes were high and the peril was real. Even Tsar understood that they had to find the spoon before they could start looking for Castle Death. And though the snowcats' paws were weary, and Wish cried herself to sleep every night for love of the enchanted spoon, they followed the enchanted key and fork deeper and deeper into the Witch Mountains. When, long ago, the Iron Warriors were on the warpath, the witches retreated further and further west, driving the giants out of their homeland of peaceful Gigantica, forcing many of them to wade out to sea along the way of the giants' footsteps, never to be seen again. It was the Druids who struck the final blow against the witches, ambushing them in their stronghold between the woods and the sea, and getting rid of them entirely. That was when the King Witch was defeated and put inside the stone. After that, the country was ruled by a great wizard called Pentaglion. But something terrible happened to him, no one quite knew what. It was rumoured that if anyone dared enter the ruins of Pentaglion's castle, Castle Death, a giant of unsurpassable size would take revenge with his very last breath. The Witch Mountains were built on a scale that was unimaginably huge. Up there, the clouds formed and reformed, and fogs descended with such suddenness that it was hard to tell what was land and what was sky. Wish had a horrible feeling they were being followed, but every time she whirled around, there was nothing there. Higher and higher they climbed, and the deer paths teetered over impossible crevasses, and at times turned into rope bridges half smashed out so that they had to clamber across them on the backs of the snowcats in driving rain. And then they climbed a peak that looked like it might be any other peak, exhausted, having almost given up hope that they would ever see the spoon again. And it was there. Not the spoon, but Castle Death. The enchanted key and the fork jumped in excitement, the fork pointing all of its prongs at the castle, and the key squeaking, "The spoon's in there! The spoon's in there!" "We weren't looking for the castle, but we found it anyway," said Wish in delight. "Oh, Tsar, this is marvellous! We can get my spoon back and the giant's last breath all at the same time." "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," moaned Caliburn. "That's quite a coincidence. I hate coincidences, because are they really coincidences, or did someone or something really intend them all along?" But Wish was too thrilled, thinking that she might find her spoon again, and Tsar was too pleased, thinking that they were going to get the first ingredient in his spell, to be anxious that this coincidence was a little suspicious. They pressed forward, even though the castle was not exactly inviting. Castle Death was half buried in vegetation, a sad corpse of a building, surrounded by a mass of thorns and briars and treacherous fogs, and with such an ominous feeling of decay about it that, hopeful and determined as they were, it was still hard to resist the urge to run away as fast as possible in the opposite direction. Crusher's eyes filled with tears.
"The halls of my ancestors," he whispered. "I never thought to see such a place."
This had been the ground of many a battle. In front of the castle was an extraordinary clatter of rock formations covered in vegetation. But these weren't exactly what they at first seemed. As Night Eye slipped on a slimy boulder, Tsar looked down and realised it wasn't a stone at all, but the hilt of an enormous sword, a sword so huge that it could only have been wielded by a giant, wound round and round with layers of brambles and thick with a cushion of a century of moss. And none of the rocks they were scrambling over were stones after all, but a carpet of these impossibly huge weapons, broken spears, the tip of a smashed enormous shield, half-buried arrows that the trees had grown through and up and around. The sign of Pentaglion was a raven, so there were carved ravens on the shields of the giants, ravens scratched into the cracked stones, ravens decorating the broken ramparts of the castle. "We shouldn't go in there," groaned Caliburn. "This is a really bad idea. I just know it's a really, really bad idea. It's cursed. I mean, who thinks this is a good idea? Because I don't." The werewolf enthusiastically agreed with him, making loud gargling noises and pointing down the mountain to indicate the direction he thought they should be going, down. "The werewolf wants us to go in anyway," said Tsar. "He says, 'Look how far we've come. We can't turn back now.'" Tsar was going in even if the castle was cursed. This could be his chance not only to get rid of his aching, worrying, burning witch-stain, but also to get rid of the witches themselves. "We have to go in," said Wish excitedly, "for the sake of Tsar's spell and to find the spoon. He's here somewhere. I know he is. Spoon! Where are you?" And the enchanted key repeated after her, "Spoon, you! Where are you?" And their two voices bounced together and mingled as their echoes came back spookily from the gigantic ruined rooms. "Shh!" whispered Bodkin, who had drawn his sword. "We don't know what's in here, and if there is something, we don't want to wake it up." They tiptoed forward. Everything was built on such an enormous scale that it created the extraordinary impression that someone had waved their staff and had turned the spell-reading party into mice. And yet, people their own size had obviously lived here too, giants and humans together. When sprites are concerned, their hearts glow green, and they give off a sulphurous smell to warn the other sprites not to go further. And all around, those sprites were burning a hot chartreuse, green as emerald, smoky with fear, queasily circling and buzzing and hissing out protection spells with so many consonants in them that the words whistled and spat like hot fat in a pan. For the dead castle seemed to be coming alive again as they entered it, and the ears of the sprites could hear the music it was singing, and it was a terrible song indeed. A song without music, a sword in the senses, a storm in the heart, and a fire in the brain. The pointed ears of Ariel swivelled to catch the sound. He opened his little forked-teeth mouth and cautiously drank a bit of the air, and his face crinkled in disgust and alarm at the searingly bitter taste of it. "Listen," whispered Ariel. "Taste." "I can't hear anything," said Bodkin, swallowing hard and holding very tight to his sword. "Stupid humans," hissed Tiffin-Storm in exasperation, holding equally firmly to her wand, sharp as any thorn. "Your dull ears can never catch the important stuff. I don't know how you have ever survived." "Let's leave now, Tsar," said Ariel. "We must go no further. Trust us, trust us, trust us." "The castle wants revenge," explained Tiffin-Storm softly, blinking into visibility beside them. "Every stone is singing of it, every creeper, every broken glass. The hum of revenge is all around us. Can you not taste the bitterness of it? Can you not hear the anger of it?" Wish peered around. She could hear nothing, but even her dull human senses could feel the savage melancholy of the atmosphere. And then, was it her imagination, or were the creepers, the ivy, the bracken that had with infinite and minute slowness pushed their green vegetative tentacles up through the broken flagstones, were they now moving? At a rate that was visible to the human eye? Yes, there it was. The ivy was moving like snakes, rustling like serpents, reaching out either pleadingly or menacingly towards them. "Are any of us doing that?" cried Wish in alarm, already knowing the answer. But the werewolf and Tsar and all of the sprites had got out their staffs and were performing encircling spells of protection to stop the encroaching plants reaching out towards them. "Somebody knows we're here," whispered Wish. "We should go back," cried Bodkin. And even as he said the words, the great broken door slammed behind them, and the vegetation choked up behind, closing the way, great roots and thorns spearing upwards like crossing swords. Tsar swallowed hard. "Of course it's going to be frightening," said Tsar stoutly. "We're looking for the ingredients of a spell to get rid of witches, and witches are not going to be vanquished by a smell of roses. Revenge is going to be a wonderful ingredient for our spell." "But we don't know who the castle wants revenge on," Caliburn pointed out nervously. He had a horrible, horrible feeling that he was returning to a forgotten past. It's a dreadful problem for a raven who has lived many lifetimes. He had some dim memory of the familiarity of the place, but he couldn't for the life of him recall any of the important details. "Well, it stands to reason that this castle will want revenge on the witches, won't it?" said Tsar. "The witches took this territory from the giants, so of course the giants' castle is going to be crossed with the witches." "But Tsar, you don't know that," groaned Caliburn. "Stories and histories are often more complicated than they look." And then they came across the shoe. It was lying in front of them, on the steps on one side, as if someone had been in a hurry and lost it. At first, they thought it must be some sort of leather tent or house, before they realised it was, in fact, a gigantic boot. A shoe so large it dwarfed even Crusher, the top of the rim of it coming up to the long-stepper high walker's waist. Crusher peered over into the cave-like depths, an expression of mild worry on his face, which was a cause for concern in itself, because Crusher did not normally worry about much. "Impossible!" marvelled Tsar. "This can't be true. Giants don't grow that big. Something that huge just could not exist." "The ancient giants were supposed to be much larger than our present giants and ogres," said Caliburn. "Gog and Magog and their descendants. We are trespassing in lands we do not understand, with mysteries and forces much bigger than we know." But Tsar was now thoroughly overexcited. "There is a giant in this castle after all," he said, drawing both his father's staff and his sword at once. "So that means we can get the giant's last breath, and that breath will be the breath of revenge." "But the giant is humongous," exclaimed Bodkin. "If he's alive, we'd have to kill him if we want his last breath. And we couldn't possibly do that because I like giants, and so does Wish, and so do you. And if he's dead, we can't get his last breath anyway." Tsar wasn't listening. "We'll just sneak up on him and check the whole situation out," said Tsar. "But whatever it is already knows we're here," wailed Bodkin. Now Wish knew what it must feel like to be the size of a sprite, for that is how small they were in comparison to this boot. With shaking steps they inched forward, and the enchanted pins, key and fork led them to an enormous door hidden in cobwebs and darkness. Behind the door was a staircase that led down, down, down underground. Crusher had to lift them all down the steps, and when they got to the bottom of the staircase they came to a hall that was way, way bigger than the last. It was impossible that a room could be that huge. a table so high that each one of its legs was as tall as one of those tree trunks from the high forests outside. A chair so enormous its existence was beyond imagining. And underneath the table was a boot to match the boot outside, and a gigantic foot with huge toes that were turning a rather unnatural green colour. And above the foot, way, way above, stretched the leg, and out of their sight must be the body of the giant. A giant larger than anyone had ever seen before or dreamed of. 10. The Giant's Last Breath. It took every single ounce of nerve in their bodies to make them move forward. Bodkin could feel his heart beating so fast it felt like it might leap out of his chest to make a run for it. He wanted to do that anyway. But then he thought of poor Tsar, shivering in the night as the witch stain crept up his arm. Tsar would have to stay forever locked up in Gormancrag if they could not find the ingredients for this spell. The witches were not going to go away if they closed their eyes and hoped for it. So Bodkin walked on. Each one of the toes of the giant came up to Wish's waist. The toes were absolutely still, unmoving. They appeared to be green. Now they got closer, not because of gangrene, but because they had been there so long that moss was growing over them, so they must not have moved for a very long time. "Is he alive, this giant?" whispered Wish, "or is he dead?" "Find out, sprites!" ordered Tsar fiercely. Bravely, Tiffinstorm and Ariel and the one sprite flew up to the head of the giant. Tiffinstorm flew back down first. "Dead," said Tiffinstorm. "But it can't have been dead for very long," argued Wish, "because after a while don't dead bodies sort of decay?" "Yucky," said Squeeze-Juice, inspecting the giant for signs of decay with delight. "These do. Let me look. Let me look." The hairy fairy buzzed around excitedly, but returned extremely disappointed. "He's just the same as when he was alive. No yucky bits, no squidgy bits. The green is just moss." "It's some kind of enchantment," said Caliburn, shivering. "An enchantment so strong I'm not sure I want to know what it is." "Which may mean," said Tsar triumphantly, "that we can get its last breath. The spell to get rid of a witch stain must be true, and this giant here must have been waiting for us to come so that it can die." "You're making a whole load of assumptions there," said Bodkin, terrified. "Maybe it's waiting so that it can eat us." "We keep telling you, giants are vegetarian," said Tsar. "Yes, but Tsar, we don't know much about the really, really big ones," said Bodkin. "Most of them waded out to sea hundreds and hundreds of years ago." But Tsar wasn't listening. "Follow me," he ordered. The snowcats and the werewolf climbed each table leg as if they were tree trunks, claws gripping either side, with Wish and Tsar and Bodkin on their backs. Tsar had never been on a giant's table before. The plates were larger than any he had ever seen, more like enormous silver lakes. The three young heroes steered their way around the massive cups and knives. The enchanted fork perched on the rim of one of the spoons, gazing down with admiration at its unfeasibly enormous cousin, a monster in spoon form. The fork shook its head, as if to say, "Will I ever grow that big? Could I?" Squeeze-Juice and Bumbleboozle and the baby, always easily distracted, had a great time slipping down the centre of the giant spoon as if it were some sort of gargantuan slide, until Tsar snapped his fingers to get them to concentrate. "We're on a mission here," whispered Tsar. "There's no time to mess about. One sprite, you're the chief spell raider. How do we get the last breath out of the giant? If there's still one in there." Up above them was the giant's head, tipped to one side. He certainly looked dead. His eyes were closed. His great wrinkled map of a face was covered in bracken and ivy, and if they'd not known that it was a giant and seen that foot down below, they might have thought it was a rock face, or some other broken landscape covered in a rich tangled mess of briars and thorns as if it were a mask. A sad face. A broken face. A lost face. The one sprite flew the falcon upwards and leapt from the bird's back. He swung for a second from one of the giant's nose hairs, peering up into the dark depths above as if it were some sort of enormous snot-filled cave. He poked his spear into one edge of giant nostril. The giant did not move. "He's dead," announced the one sprite, dropping back onto the falcon. "Yes, I know he's probably dead," said Tsar impatiently. "The point is, how do we get a last breath out of him?" And then, as if in response to Tsar's question and making them all jump, there was a reverberating sound like the noise of a muffled distant drum, and a slight wheezing wind poured faintly out of the nostrils above, like the breeze in coral caves. Oh, by green things and white things and mistletoe and ivy, the giant wasn't dead after all. "The beast is alive," whispered Ariel, burning so bright green with alarm that he shone like a torch. The giant twitched. Oh my, he's moving," said Squeeze-Juice. Slowly, the great eye above cracked open the mess of thorns above it, and one enormous eye focused grimly on the children, an eye you could lose yourself in, a mighty desolation like the desert of the ocean. And then the great mountain above them jerked upwards with such startling suddenness that the plates bowled over, and the young heroes lost their balance on the table, set a-shaking by his sudden coming to life. They all forgot that giants are not ogres and that they're supposed to be vegetarian, even the really, really big ones, and they scattered like scurrying ants across the table for safety under the plate rims and to hide under the forks. Their hearts beating like rabbits, they cowered, Bodkin under a plate rim, Tsar flattened behind a salt cellar, Wish under the spoon. "Don't move," whispered Tsar. Was the giant friendly? Or was it unfriendly? Did it know they were there? Had it seen them? They could hear the giant breathing now, the wheeze in and out of its lungs like some great wind, and suddenly it seemed that their quest might have been a little, well, foolish. Bodkin held his breath. Maybe the giant didn't know they were there. Minutes passed. There was silence again. Bodkin began to breathe a little easier. And then a very beautiful voice, one that definitely could not have belonged to a giant, said sweetly and out of nowhere, "There's one hiding under the plate." And blam! The sheltering plate above Bodkin went spinning from above his head and sailing across the room, where it smashed with ear-shattering violence. That was a little too, well, rough for the giant to be entirely friendly, and when Bodkin looked up at the face looming above him like a great green god, the glowering fury of its expression was unmistakable. It's all very well, people telling you not to move when you're being charged by a forest animal, or if a great desolation of a giant is poised over you, but in those sorts of situations instincts tend to kick in, and Bodkin ran across the table with some considerable speed. Slam! A fleeing Bodkin was caught by a mighty force from above that sent him sprawling, oof, onto his stomach, and when he scrambled, petrified back to his feet, an immense hand imprisoned him like a great green cave. Peering out from behind the spoon, Wish shouted, "Bodkin's been trapped!" Forgetting all about how much she liked giants, she ran forward and jabbed one of the massive fingers with her sword, and it couldn't have been much more than a pinprick, but the finger startled upward, and then all three humans were scurrying and running and weaving and dodging across the table, with the giant and frankly not very friendly hand slamming down around them trying to catch them. Which it did, eventually. Tsar and Bodkin hid in the salt cellar, but the giant shook them out and pinned them to the table between the prongs of a fork. And then the giant took a cup and slammed it over Wish. For one horrible moment she thought she would be trapped there forever, but the giant flipped the cup over, picked her up, and dropped her in it. And there she hung, peering with one terrified eye over the rim into the grim eyes of the enormous and, let's face it, extremely annoyed giant. An unintelligible noise came out of the giant's mouth. It was opening and shutting as if it were making words, but the wheeze of his voice meant it was impossible to hear what he was saying. He paused. The three children looked at one another, terrified. None of them could make head nor tail of what he was talking about. The giant spoke again, equally unintelligibly, soft anger in the wheezing. Caliburn bravely flew up to the giant's mouth so that he could hear more clearly. The giant seemed to be choking, fighting for breath, until, from out of nowhere, an ethereal little something appeared in a trail of light. Something so bright it made you blink to look at it, and the something poured a little potion into the choking giant's mouth, and the dusty desolation drank it down greedily. "What is that?" asked Wish with an open mouth, trying to look at the brilliant little something as it dashed past. It didn't look quite like any other sprite or elf she had ever seen before.
"I am a frost sprite who once belonged to the great wizard Pentaglion," said the little something, moving so quickly they still couldn't see what it was. "But you can call me Eleanor Rose. That is not my name, but it's a very pretty one, don't you think?"
Eleanor Rose, for that was not her name, had a very beautiful voice that reminded you of running water or bells. It must have been she who had told the giant where they were.
"And this big decaying chap here is Preponderous," said Eleanor Rose,
as if they'd all dropped in for a cosy chat, rather than broken into a ruined castle whose name was Death.
"So, since we're all here, perhaps you might introduce yourselves. Preponderous and I have not had company for many a long year, and even when we do, uninvited guests tend not to stay very long, particularly if they are burglars."
There was something a little sinister in the last statement, even though she said it perfectly good-naturedly, even somewhat sadly. They didn't need Caliburn to whisper, "Don't trust her." Eleanor Rose didn't appear offended. She even agreed, and might have been nodding her head if she'd been still enough for them to see her.
"Yes, it's probably wiser for human beings not to trust me. Frost sprites have no hearts, you see."
The giant spoke in a wheezy whisper, which was nonetheless very loud to human ears, for he was so very large a giant.
"Who," said the giant, "are you, little ants, little nothingnesses? And how dare you disturb the peace of a giant of the ancient lines who is on the verge of dying? Is nothing sacred?"
"Oh, you're on the verge of dying, are you?" said Tsar without thinking, and heartily pleased to hear it. "Excellent!" The giant blinked down at them. Bodkin prodded Tsar frantically. Tsar started, suddenly realising that it wasn't very polite to be seeming to welcome the imminent death of your host.
"I mean, we're very sad to hear that," said Tsar hurriedly. Eleanor Rose laughed again. "Oh, don't worry," she said kindly. "You're on the verge of dying too."
Are we?" stammered Bodkin anxiously.
"Of course you are," said Eleanor Rose with great humour. "What did you expect? You're entering, uninvited, a castle whose name is Death, with the burglarious intention to steal something infinitely precious from one of the inhabitants within, who also happens to be your unwilling host. Don't bother to deny it."
For Tsar had opened up his mouth in instinctive denial.
"Unless,"
said Eleanor Rose. "Unless," prompted Wish, ever hopeful.
"Unless you are the people we have been waiting for, which is terribly unlikely considering the amount of people there are in the Wild Woods, and how surprising it would be if they were to accidentally make their way here," said Eleanor Rose, "which is the reason we have been waiting such a very, very long time. So who are you?"
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. They had to hope the spelling book had not tricked them. They had to hope that their names would be good enough.
"Tell the truth,"
Eleanor Rose advised them.
"I am Tsar, son of Incanzo, boy of destiny," said Tsar. "And this is Wish, daughter of Sycorax. And this is Bodkin, assistant bodyguard."
There was a long, long silence, and Eleanor Rose was still enough for Squeeze-Juice to see her clearly for one tantalising second, and for Squeeze-Juice to say with a sigh, "Oh, how pretty you are."
"Beauty is not everything," said Eleanor Rose, on the move again, "but the universe has found that sometimes it helps. And impossibility isn't everything either, but it is surprising, particularly considering the nature of impossibility, how often the universe is depending on one unlikely chance."
Bodkin and Tsar and Wish had been holding their breaths, but now they let them out again with relief.
"Of all the numberless names of people in these wild woods, you are the right ones," said Eleanor Rose.
"Thank goodness for that," breathed Bodkin.
"At last," said the giant. "Are they worthy?"
Eleanor Rose hovered in front of all of them and touched them one by one. Tsar, Bodkin, Wish, and finally Caliburn, testing them for worthiness. Each of them cried out at the moment of contact, as if they'd been hit by a sharp electric shock. Eleanor Rose circled the room twice before she gave her pronouncement.
"There is room for improvement," said Eleanor Rose, "particularly in the one who calls himself the boy of destiny. But what can you expect from the humans? However, when it comes to the worthiness of the bird, why, the bird—" Caliburn ruffled his feathers, preparing to make modest protestations. This was his moment. "The talking bird is the least worthy of all," said Eleanor Rose. "Oh!" cried Caliburn, very offended. "I think you must have mistook me. I am Caliburn, the bird who has lived many lifetimes, and I have been put in charge of Tsar precisely because of my wisdom and my worthiness." "Yes," said Eleanor Rose, with an audible dismissive sniff that still managed to sound affectionate. "And perhaps you might like to think why, after all those lifetimes, you have ended up as a bird. I know perfectly well who you are, Raven, and age is no proof of worthiness, or indeed of wisdom. We'll just have to make do, Preponderous, and hope for the best, as is often the case with the humans. We can't wait any longer. I'm finding it harder and harder to slow down the dying process, and those are, after all, the right names." The giant snorted with relief. "So," said Eleanor Rose, "you have come here to steal something? Don't bother lying. Just tell me what it is." "We have come to take the giant's last breath," said Tsar defiantly. "We need it as part of our spell to get rid of the witches." "Ah," breathed the giant with desperate satisfaction in a great wind above them. "They are the right ones." "That is precious, very precious," said Eleanor Rose solemnly. "It is not something the likes of you could steal from a giant of the ancient lines, but luckily for you, he will give it to you willingly. I presume you have come prepared?" "We have," said Tsar promptly. "The one sprite here is a great spell raider. He will catch the breath, and Tiffinstorm will shrink it, and between them they will put the breath in this collecting bottle here." Eleanor Rose laughed again. "Oh, you humans, you're so funny. Your plans are so inadequate, and yet you keep making them. You hadn't a hope of doing that on your own, but I will help you." "You shall have your wish," said Eleanor Rose, "and maybe, as is the way of things, a little more than you wished for as well. Settle down, everyone. Make yourselves comfortable." Eleanor Rose did not bring out a wand or a staff or make any sort of movement that could be interpreted as spelling, but the fork lifted itself off Tsar and Bodkin, and the cup tipped over gently, depositing Wish on the table. "The giant is going to tell you a story, and I am going to help." Way above them, the not-quite-dead giant's words came booming out with such loudness they had to put their hands over their ears.
"Let me tell you a story,"
said the giant. "A story?" said Tsar between clenched teeth, for the words really were very, very loud. "You don't like stories?" said Eleanor Rose in surprise. "I love stories," said Tsar. "But what is the giant doing telling a story? This is supposed to be his last breath. Surely you can't tell a whole story with one last breath. And we're in a bit of a hurry here. It's complicated, but the druids and the wizards and the warriors and the witch smeller and the witches themselves are all chasing after us, and they could be here any moment. And my companion, Wish here, has lost her enchanted spoon, and we have to find it. Have you seen him?" said Wish anxiously. "My fork and key are convinced he's in here somewhere. He's about so high, made of iron, and—" "What did I say?" interrupted Eleanor Rose. "Plenty of room for improvement. You need to learn patience, boy and girl. There is always time for a story. The giant will give you his last breath, and in return you will listen to his story patiently, quietly, and humbly, for those are all things you need to learn. That is your payment, if you will." So in the heart of Castle Death, Wish and Caliburn and Tsar and Bodkin and the Snowcats and the Sprites and Crusher the giant sat down cross-legged, or put their shaggy heads on their paws, or folded their wings, or lay on their backs with their 8 legs in the air, depending on what or who they were. All of them listened quietly, obediently, and even Tsar tried to be as patient and respectful as he could as they listened to the story. Now, the last words of anyone who is dying have a magical power. But the last words of a giant of such extraordinary immenseness, why, those have more power than most. In real life, this story was being told by a great giant the size of a small hillside, in the last stages of dying, crumbling at the edges and a trifle fly-infested, in a voice that was sometimes louder than the loudest thunder, and at other times breaking and wheezing and barely there,
And when his voice broke at the edges, like the crumbling of his fingers, and became so faint that you could hardly hear it, the story was taken up by the frost sprite, who was the absolute opposite, tiny and ever-moving, with a voice like the never-heard music of the universe and turning stars and the tiny bell-like chime of time. But if I tell it like that, it will make it hard to concentrate on the story, and the story is important. So I will speak it in my own voice, the voice of the unknown narrator. This was the story the giant told. It was the story of the giant's last breath. The story was dying to be told. Once upon a time, there was a ferocious young warrior princess, as wild as any werewolf. She was afraid of nothing, this warrior princess, and her hunting skills were the talk of the empire. All alone, she fought the frost giants of the frozen north. All alone, she captured the dreadful grim Anise of the west. All alone, she scared off the Roger breaths that were raiding the warrior villages in the south. The warrior princess did not believe in love. "Love is weakness," said the princess. "I'm really hoping this isn't going to be a love story," said Tsar in disgust, before remembering he was supposed to be quiet and respectful, and hurriedly shutting his mouth again. One day, the princess was riding alone and free through the wildwoods in the depths of midwinter, when she realized that she was being chased by a couple of snowcats. She shot arrows at the snowcats, and 2 of them hit their targets, but still they pursued her. Eventually she realized they wanted her to follow them, and she was so impressed by their bravery that this she did. The snowcats led her to a clearing where there was a circle of gigantic wolves waiting patiently at the bottom of a tree. There was a young man up in the tree, and the wolves were waiting for him to grow so tired he would fall out like a large ripe apple. 2 days he had been up there, and he was dropping with hunger and thirst and fear. At the bottom of the tree lay the young man's wizard staffs, for he had climbed the tree to rescue one of his sprites. The young man, whose name was Algor Cuperquin, but that sounds like something choking on a walnut, so everyone called him Tor, was singing a very stupid song, in the princess's opinion, which went something like this. "I am young, I am poor, I can offer you nothing. All that I have is this bright pair of wings, this air that I eat, these winds that I sleep on, this star path I dance in where the moon sings." Now the princess knew that she should have ridden on at that point. This young man was clearly a wizard, and wizards were the warrior's deadly enemies, and he was also clearly a very silly young man. But there was something so human about the silliness of this song that it made her pause. The princess loaded her bow and shot an arrow towards the wizard, not to hit him exactly, but just to see if he would flinch. He didn't, even though it passed so bitingly close that it grazed his left arm. The princess was impressed, for she admired bravery even in wizards. The wolves got to their feet and snarled warningly at her, padding restlessly round the tree. The princess loaded her bow again, pointed it at the wolves, and called out sneeringly, "What are you doing, talking to trees, you stupid wizard?" "I'm not talking to trees," said the wizard. "I'm talking to you." He carried on with the song. "See the swift soar, they live well on nothing. You are young, you are strong, if you'll give me your hand. We'll leave earth entirely and never go back there. We'll sleep on the breezes and never touch land. I promise you gales and a merry adventure. We'll fly on forever and never will part. I am young, I am poor, I can offer you nothing, nothing but love and the beat of my heart." And then he just said, "Help me." "What will you give me if I rescue you, wizard?" called the princess. There was silence from the treetops, and then the wizard replied, "What do you want most in the world?" The princess replied, swift as one of her arrows, "I want to be the warrior queen of this whole forest." The princess, you see, was always meant to be the queen of the whole forest, but her throne had been stolen when she was a baby by one of her evil cousins, so she was wishing for something she had wanted her very whole life. The wizard, called Tor, looked down at her. "All right. I can't make you a warrior queen," admitted Tor, "but I can give you a horse. A queen needs a good horse." "I already have a horse, stupid," said the princess, laughing. "I'm riding it." "Back at home in my wizard camp, I have a horse far better than that horse you are riding, a horse as black as night and as swift as spell readers. "I will give it to you if you rescue me," said Tor. "It isn't magic," he added hastily. "It's just an ordinary horse. You'll like it." So the princess, who was really just looking for an excuse to save this silly young man, shot her arrows at the wolves, and the wolves began to chase her. They hunted her through the forest, the princess shooting back at them over her shoulder, and Tor climbed down from the tree, picked up his wizard staffs, and followed after her on his injured snowcat. He caught up with her at just the moment when the wolf pack took down her horse. The princess drew her sword, and he used his spelling staffs, and together they fought the wolves. But there were so very many of them that they had to climb aboard the snowcat to run away and leave the wolves with the horse. "You've made me lose my horse," protested the princess as they rode together through the forest on the back of the snowcat. "It was the horse or us," said Tor. "That's why I offered you one of my own horses if you rescued me." And that was the moment that the princess realized that wizards were tricky. The princess didn't mind that. She was tricky herself. The wizard, now that she could see his face up close in the moonlight, was a very silly, tricky young man, but undeniably a little bit handsome. And he hadn't flinched when she shot him. And that was how the princess lost her heart in the forest. "It is about love," said Tsar in disgust. "Shh!" hissed everyone else, because they wanted to hear the end of the story. The warrior princess agreed to meet the wizard in the same clearing a week later, so he could bring her the horse. "This will be the last time I meet him," said the princess to herself. Tor gave her a horse called Thunderbird, which certainly wasn't swifter than Spell Raiders or darker than midnight. It was a perfectly normal horse, except in one respect. Every second Thursday, if she happened to be riding it, it would carry her off, and however hard she pulled on the reins, it would take her through the forest back to the clearing where she first met Tor. Tor would be waiting for her, and they would spend the afternoon being silly together. The young warrior princess swore that she would marry Tor. She promised on her heart that they would run away together and find themselves a world where it did not matter where they came from, where wizards and warriors could love and live in peace. And then... tragedy. The princess's wicked cousin died, and that meant that she was now queen of the warriors. She had all that she had ever been wanting for her very whole life, and now that she had it, she found that she did not want it after all. Oh, you must be careful what you wish for, guys. It may come true. For here's the thing about becoming a queen. It brought with it responsibilities, duties. The new queen's people needed her, for if she were not the queen, it would be one or other of the wicked cousins, with their taxes and their wars of vengeance and their endless thirst for such delicacies as blood of werecats as an aperitif, which may have been delicious but was costly in human lives. So the young princess felt she had to be the queen, and a queen of warriors cannot marry a wizard. But how should she get rid of her love? A true love's kiss is the strongest thing in the world. It cannot be got rid of by sneezing. So the young princess did a terrible thing. She had heard of an extremely powerful wizard called Pentaglion, who was living all alone and was doing experiments into looking into the future, dabbling in that dangerous practice. She travelled to see him. They looked into the future together, and what they saw there was that if she were to marry the young boy called Tor, the witches would return to the forest. So the princess had to get rid of her love forever. And there was only one way. Pentaglion gave her the spell of Love Denied, which is a very, very dangerous spell indeed. The sprites all gasped at the sound of the spell of Love Denied. Squeezejuice curled himself up so tightly in Wish's hair that she let out a small squeal. Only Squeezejuice's eyes were peeping out, wide with alarm. The warrior princess drank the spell, and the love died in her heart. She wrote a letter to the wizard boy called Tor, written in poison ink and bitterage, saying she did not love him and never had. Meanwhile, Tor waited many long weeks in the appointed waiting place, and the warrior princess never came. He got the letter. He read it, refused to believe it. 2 years he waited. A hut grew around him, and the sprites in the forest felt so sorry for him they brought him food and water. They called him the Wizard Who Waits. Tor knew in his heart of hearts that the princess had betrayed him, and eventually he came to believe the letter. He got word that the warrior princess had married someone else and was now calling herself the Queen of the Warriors. The wizard went so mad with unhappiness, he went to fight in the hinterlands and became a shadow man. "Oh, how cool," breathed Tsar, for the shadow men were legendary.
And now we reach my part of the story, said the giant. You see, the castle you are standing in was once the castle of Pentaglion.
Tsar and Wish and Bodkin held their breaths. They had got so caught up in the story they had forgotten that it might be true. They looked at the smashed remains of the castle all around them. What had happened here?
And the giant you are listening to is Pentaglion's giant, and this is where I come into the story.
The giant's voice was drenched in bitterness at this point.
Unfortunately, one of the essential ingredients of the spell of love denied was the tears of a druid. And druids don't like having their tears taken. The druids set about tracking the man who had taken their tears, and when they found him, they killed not only the extremely powerful wizard Pentaglion, but they tried to kill his giant and took his little baby werewolf into captivity. And that giant, finished the giant, was me. So many years I have been angry, so angry at the injustice of it that I have not been able to die. I have burned with anger, roared the giant. The boiling, impossible heat of my fury has kept me here. So angry, thundered the giant, and the sound of the giant's anger, even though he was dying, rumbled out of his great giant chest like 1,000 bears are roaring, echoing its way around the room, sending the table shaking. I am not afraid to die, but I have had unfinished business, said the giant, and with my last breath I urge you. There was a great pause, for the last breath of giants is a terrible thing. Revenge, whispered Tsar, highly excited. He wants revenge. Don't worry, giant, I'm pretty cross with those druids myself. You can pass that quest right on to me. Tsar's your man. Tsar was delighted, because the last breath of a giant was one thing, but the dying vengeance wish of a giant, that was a very powerful ingredient indeed. That would be extremely helpful if you wanted to get rid of the witches. Get ready, everyone, shouted Tsar. The giant's about to go. Oh, poor giant, said Wish. Have a little respect, Tsar. These are his dying moments. He's been dying for years, said Tsar. We're doing him a favour. You're cross, aren't you, giant? So angry you haven't been able to die. Give us your fury. We need all of it. With my last breath, I urge you, said the giant. He clutched his throat. He was about to go, fighting for breath. I urge you. I urge you. Forgive